Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. Now, before all of you come guns blazing at me for calling Bonnie the worst character on the Vampire Diaries, hear me out. Out of the three main female leads, Bonnie is the most powerful character because she's a witch. Yet, she's the doormat for the others to survive. And if you haven't noticed, she's the one who has been done the most dirty by the writers of TVD in all the seasons of Vampire Diaries. So I had actually read the books of the Vampire Diaries, and in the books, Bonnie was a redheaded teenager who was frail and mostly shy. But as the series progressed, she became a secondary POV character and definitely one of the most popular girls in TVD, verse in the books at least. And she even has her own romantic track with Damon, a ship which became hugely popular among the readers of the book. As a reader, I was excited for this ship the most because the shy witch with the bad boy vampire was my jam back in the days. When the show aired, however, we saw a different Bonnie. A different and a really good Bonnie, which I admit at that time I didn't like, but now that I look back, Bonnie was actually quite the interesting character. She was played by Kat Graham, a dark-haired biracial woman who was amazing in her job. Instead of her shy traits, Bonnie in the TV series was more confident and outspoken with a deep-rooted moral ground. All this was fine because Kat Graham was such an amazing performer. She brought Bonnie to life in a way that none of us would have expected it, and she was so amazing in her job. But with the change in her skin color, there was also a change in the historical background of the book. So in the book, it was the Renaissance period. The Salvatores were from the Renaissance period. But instead of the original Renaissance period, the Salvatores were from the 1800s America and tied to Bonnie's ancestors in the TV show. Now, I'm not American, and when I was watching the show at that time, I didn't have a ton of information about the slavery and Confederacy in America. I was unaware of a lot of things. The political backdrop of the changes was unknown to me, so the writers didn't really connect me with Bonnie's past ancestry, and it was a mishap on their end because as a show watcher and as a reader, I just could not connect with her because I was thinking, okay, what has this got to do with anything? Why is this relevant? What is the context behind it? But this was such an important part of Bonnie's heritage and her identity. The writers glossed all over this to make the Salvatores a more complex characters instead of giving Bonnie the complexity that she needed in order to become a better witch. Bonnie's ancestor was given the crumbs by being a handmaiden to Catherine and only became prominent at the very end of the whole Salvatore-Catherine saga set in the 1850s when she had to seal the vampires in a cave. And then her legacy sort of came on to Bonnie and her family. Bonnie's ties to this part of the history was treated more as an afterthought rather than keeping it as a full-fleshed story arc because this had so many things. This had the elements of slavery, this had the elements of being tied to supernatural, being having so much power, and yet being tied to the people who are forcing the witches to use their magic for something bad and for their own gains rather than for the good. So this is a connection we barely see throughout the series, and this has been very disappointing for a show lover like me. Similarly, Bonnie as a character was never given an actual personality outside of her friend circle. I remember Elena and Caroline having very distinct ambitions. For example, I remember Elena used to write a journal, and hence the whole title of Vampire Diaries, and she wanted to become a doctor. And Caroline wanted to become a journalist, but later she became a mother and inheritor to Stefan's fortune, even had sort of a happy ending with Klaus, unless you watch the originals, but I digress. But what happened is that they achieved something by the end of the series. They had something to lean on. Bonnie, even from the first to the last season, I did not know what she did in her free time. I had no idea what she did in her free time. I had no idea what her hobbies were. I didn't even know if she had any ambitions. So At the end, she was just given this loose end that, okay, travel the world like Enzo wanted, but that's still what Enzo wanted for her. But what did she want for herself? We didn't really get to connect with her. Over the series, we see the other characters having hobbies. Elena, journaling, Caroline, cheerleader, and everything. Damon probably handled a lot of the business of the Salvatores as well, but Bonnie, do we remember any activity she was given for us to connect with her as a person? She was never really given any such interest, or at least not a memorable one that we can remember. Outside her friends and her powers, we don't get to know Bonnie's interests or hobbies. The writers never let us fans connect with her or even get to know her outside of the friend circle. Kat Graham played the role of Bonnie's insecurities and mishaps with her magic really well, but the writers just cut out so much from her character and sort of used her as this token black friend. Also, in most cases, Bonnie was treated like a lone wolf. All the characters of TVD were messed up. Don't get me wrong, they got it themselves in a lot of trouble. Putting all the violence caused by the Salvatores aside, characters like Elena, Caroline, and who can forget Jeremy always put themselves in severe danger, sometimes even on purpose, sometimes at the cost of their own lives. But their mistakes were written as self-sacrificing or even noble. Even Damon got free passes on everything he did. Things he did to Caroline in season 1, we kind of just forgot about it over the course of the season suddenly, and Caroline also forgave him. Yay! But Bonnie's prejudice against vampires was shown to be hypocritical, and the fans were outraged back then at her. Whenever Bonnie put a boundary on herself that she's not going to help the vampires, she's not going to help the supernatural, she was sort of guilt tripped into being the helper. The fans hated her whenever she said no. The fans just wanted to backlash at her. I can't explain the hate the character used to receive from the fandom. In fact, there was a time when even I didn't like her, but now that I look back at Bonnie's character, I think that, okay, she was putting boundaries which were not respected. She was peer pressured into helping people whom she didn't want to help because those people were responsible for her grandpa's death. And yet, she's somehow expected to help them. It just doesn't make sense to me now. And the hatred, the vitriol she received, oh my god, on all the fan websites, the forums, the blogs, there wasn't a single person actually rooting for her except for the African American community probably, but now everyone is saying that Bonnie was actually the hero of the story. Also, compared to the more popular characters like the Salvatores and Mikkelsons, who were hundreds of years old, Bonnie was still a teenager, just like 15 or 16 when the show started. The Mikkelsons and Salvatores and all the vampires committed way worse acts, and people still disliked Bonnie more than them. Bonnie's actions were never interpreted as a teenager who was literally fighting for her life. Rather, other characters who did worse and were much older than her got the free pass. Klaus, who started off as the main villain, actually had his own fandom with Caroline, which was kind of weird to me back then, but now that I look at it, I understand the appeal too. Bonnie never got that free pass. She didn't get any relief after gaining her powers. Everyone just dragged her into their mess and she helped them fix it. But no one actually helped Bonnie when she needed them. When Bonnie gave up her life for Jeremy, none of her friends noticed that she was gone. Not one of them thought for an entire month, hey, where is Bonnie? Where is she? What's she up to? Let's catch up with her. Not one of them realized she was dead. While Bonnie went above and beyond for her friends, and no one did the same for her unless Elena wanted it. Everything circled around Elena. Unless Elena wanted her to live, Bonnie lives. Otherwise, no one really cared about Bonnie, except for Damon perhaps in the later series, and then Enzo and Jeremy, who were also there. But I digress. Damon did worse things, even though he's my favorite character. Bonnie's main romantic relationship in the books was with Damon. The show completely removed it. Instead, they were given a platonic friendship somewhere in season 5 and 6, and I actually enjoyed it. They were bickering, they were bringing out the best, but there was a romantic tension as well. But the writers just didn't want the whole Bonnie and Damon thing to be as popular because it was so popular in the books. I can't explain how popular it was in the books because people were shipping the shy girl with the big bad vampire. They were shipping the powerful witch and Damon, and this was such a whole trope in the books. This was so big in the books. I can't explain it, but once you actually watch the show and you know that the characters and the actors had such amazing chemistry, they could have gone to the whole Baemon route, but the writers just didn't want to give Bonnie that chance. Instead, we get her first with Jeremy. Now, when I was watching the show, Jeremy was actually one of my least favorite characters. I remember disliking this ship so much, not because that this ship had any grounds or solid base, but there was very little given to these characters for me to root for them. I remember Jeremy at the time was constantly getting into trouble with his vampire girlfriends, or being a whiny brat for most of the part and putting everyone else in danger and everything. And then you have Bonnie, who barely has a fleshed out character outside her powers and friends. And you put these two together, what's going to happen? Do you expect me as a fan to actually root for them? I mean, they were suddenly do or die for each other. Like, they wanted to give themselves up, they were ready to sacrifice. And even though initially the ship wasn't exactly sailing for me, but then when I was starting to get into them, bam, they break over. Over what? Jeremy cheating on Bonnie with his ex's ghost. The most ridiculous part of the Vampire Diaries. And I'm not even kidding, it was horrible. It was bad, lazy writing just to put Bonnie in a miserable state, and I hated that part. And that was, I think, the first time I really connected with Bonnie, because that is so lame. That is such a lame way to write off a relationship. And I'm supposed to believe that these two, who will do anything to protect and save each other, will break up over this, and Jeremy will cheat on Bonnie with his ex's ghost. I mean, it was infuriating. Because when they were developing, the writers just threw us in the mud. It was just awful. I mean, the writers clearly loathed Bonnie. They didn't want her to become more powerful than Elena or Caroline, but she was powerful. And the fans at that time didn't help either, because they were so anti-Bonnie. There may have been some racial undertone to it. I'm not gonna go too much into that, but there was a lot of backlash against Bonnie. A lot. There was not a single popular forum, at least not the popular ones, as I said, which had supported Bonnie. In fact, now that I think about it, Kat Graham also did not get a lot of marketing promotions. She barely got the magazine covers. She barely got solos. She had a wonderful voice, and they never used her as a background in the music. They had glossed her over a few times. She was put out of action for many episodes compared to the other characters. And it was horrible. It was really, really bad treatment of the character and the actor who played it. Bonnie also didn't get any significant love interests other than some scattered here and there who tried to take advantage of her or who were actually bad guys. It wasn't until Enzo that Bonnie finally got someone who would go to any lengths to protect her. Any lengths. They were quintessential enemies to lover trope and were compatible. Finally, the fans were able to root for Bonnie. They were able to root for Enzo. They were able to find that Bonnie had her soulmate. They were so, so happy for her. And her development with Enzo was one of the best in the series. She finally had some stability. She finally had someone to protect her. She finally didn't have to do everything that others asked her to do. And she also had this 3-year period with him where she was completely happy, blissfully happy. She didn't have to worry about anything. But then the writers went ahead and had Stefan, of all people, kill Enzo in the most shocking way. In every season, the moment Bonnie got some form of stability, it was taken away from her. She was the character who lost the most, yet loved the most. Most infuriating thing was how Bonnie's traumas were handled. Remember when her gramps died? Remember when her father passed away? Remember when all the vampires were after her life? Remember when she was in a prison world and tortured by Kai? Yeah, she was never given a break. She was never given a time to grieve for herself or even deal with everything that's going on. Elena grieved for her parents all throughout season 1. Caroline got full episodes dealing with her mother and father's losses. Like, she was dealing with trauma and grief, and we saw everyone there for her. We saw funerals, we saw these ends being tied up for her, and everything was addressed in a very organic way for these characters. Even most beautiful moment in TVD, in my opinion, Damon and Rose's last scene, even that was a closure for Damon. We saw Damon's trauma and grief. We saw Stefan's trauma and grief. But we never saw Bonnie getting time to mourn for herself and for her losses. She couldn't mourn for her grandmother. She couldn't mourn for her father. She couldn't miss her mother. She had no way to breathe. She was always being pulled to action. Her father's death was barely mentioned, and Bonnie's abandonment issues with her mother was also treated as an afterthought. The PTSD she suffered from after returning from the prison world, it was suddenly gone after she dealt with Guy. It really didn't make sense. PTSD does not go away just like that. It was never addressed again. It was never talked about again. No one actually took Bonnie to a therapist and say, hey, you need therapy for it. She constantly saw people around her being hurt or become cursed or lost them in the worst way. Her losses were profound but never explored the way other characters once were. The writers didn't let us connect with Bonnie. She was compassionate, strong, and a great role model for women who didn't tolerate nonsense. And that was a very big step towards inclusivity in the mainstream TV during the 2010s, because Bonnie was one of those rare POC characters who were aware of their shortcomings, who were strong, who were compassionate, who put themselves out there to save everyone, and she was so powerful. In fact, she's considered one of the most powerful witches on TV. But her writing, the lousy writing, just destroyed anything that Bonnie stood up for. Writers didn't let us connect, and instead of appreciation, Bonnie received flack from the writers and the fandom. She was the unsung hero of Vampire Diaries because, let's face it, none of the characters could have survived if Bonnie hadn't saved them countless of times. So, tell me what you think about Bonnie Bennett. If you want more video analysis of Vampire Diaries, be sure to comment and subscribe for more updates ahead. Thank you.